So far, we have seen evidence that religious cues were no different from secular cues in their effects on prosociality, and religions are sometimes concerned with secular, non-moral issues. This suggests that morality can't be said to depend on religion. So the last question is religion necessary for morality? This graph gives you a sense of many Americans' likely answer to this question. It shows the percentage of US samples' yes responses when asked if they'd be willing to vote for various social categories of people as presidential candidates. Catholics, Jewish people, African Americans, atheists, homosexuals. And the years that they ran this study were 1958, 1978, and 1999. Unlike the other cases, some of which by 1999 got up to around 95%, people's willingness to vote for an atheist president is low, very low, from 18% in 1958 to 40% in 1978 to still only about half of people in 1999. If religion is not the source of morality when researchers measure their relationship, what sets the average American's perceptions of Catholic and Jewish presidential candidates apart from atheists? The traditional link of religion and moral behavior has a long intellectual history. John Locke said, "Those are not at all to be tolerated who deny the being of a God. Promises, covenants, and oaths, which are the bonds of human society, can have no hold upon an atheist. The taking away of God, though but even in thought, dissolves all." Locke claimed that atheists couldn't be trusted because they disregard belief in promises and oaths. He conflates the capacity to be faithful to a contract, the underpinning of a functioning society, with the capacity to be faithful to God. The belief that religion is necessary for morality might be present broadly, but when we ask this question, is religion necessary for morality, we're attempting to discern from two possibilities. First, if morality is following a code of rules that's imposed from the outside of a person that defines good and bad behavior, then it's possible that religion is necessary for morality. Or if morality is behaving according to internalized norms about good and bad behavior or results from evolved psychological adaptations, then it's possible that religion is unnecessary for morality. What does the science show us? Saslow and colleagues investigated prosocial behavior as a function of religiousness versus compassion. Let's break down their 3 studies. In the research, religiousness was measured on a continuum, and researchers sorted participants into 2 groups, less religious and more religious. Then they asked participants to complete a measure of how compassionate they usually felt, or trait compassion. This design allowed them to understand the influence of religiousness separately from the influence of being compassionate. Participants' average amount of prosocial behavior, or unselfish behavior toward others, is portrayed on the y-axis in this graph. On the x-axis, we can see that people lower in trait compassion and people higher in trait compassion are represented there. The dotted line represents more religious people, and the solid line represents less religious people. Starting with people lower in trait compassion on the left there, who reported typically not feeling very many pangs of sympathy, they gave the least when they were also less religious. However, prosociality significantly increased when people low in compassion were religious. But among people higher in trait compassion, often feeling sympathy for others, the pattern flips. People who are also more religious gave slightly less than people who are less religious. This study is evidence that prosociality does not necessarily require religiosity. The highest givers here were less religious, but high in compassion. However, the study also shows that there's a positive effect of religion in general. It's dependent, though, on the person not typically feeling compassionate. Study 1 suggested that for highly compassionate people, you don't get much of a bump from being religious. But for people who are low in compassion, it seems like being religious does increase prosociality. Perhaps the giving of less religious people is more susceptible to shifts in feelings of compassion. In study 2, the researchers tested whether induced feelings of compassion in the lab, rather than self-reports about being compassionate typically, would affect less religious people differently than more religious people. Prosociality was measured as behavior in the dictator game, and more prosociality was considered being more likely to give half your endowment as the dictator, $5 out of $10. In the lab, more and less religious people were placed in either the compassion induction condition or the neutral control condition. In the compassion induction condition, participants watched the compassion video, which featured information about child poverty, a series of photographs of helpless and vulnerable children, and sad, evocative music playing in the background. In the neutral control video, it was just two men talking. This graph shows what happened to giving, on the y-axis, when participants who were more and less religious first watched the compassion video or just watched that neutral video. The results are similar to study 1. More religious people were more pro-social on average. And compassion didn't seem to matter. They gave more after the compassion induction and after the neutral video. Less religious people gave less on average, and this was driven by less religious people in that neutral condition. Less religious people who were induced to be compassionate by watching that video about the vulnerable children, they actually gave amounts that were closest to the fair split of 5 out of 10. So again, religiousness seems to be associated with morality in the form of giving. However, it does not seem to be necessary, as less religious people can be influenced to give more than religious people by their feelings of compassion. Study 3 represents more evidence for this same pattern. Generosity across various tasks was measured as a function of state compassion this time, or current feelings of compassion and religiousness. A measure of state compassion predicted increased generosity across economic tasks for less religious individuals, but not more religious individuals. So again, this is suggestive of the possibility that compassion can induce less religious people to give similarly to religious people.